I just wanted to share my thinking on this. It's about the Shroud of Turin, which is a shroud in the Cathedral of Turin in Italy. And this is so fascinating, and I've been looking at it for a few months now. It's an overlap between science, pathology, medicine, all aspects of science with history.
For centuries, people have always believed that the existence of the Shroud of Turin is the clearest evidence proving the presence of Jesus. For this reason, scientists have continuously strived to uncover the mysteries hidden behind this sacred cloth. Dr. John Campbell recently discovered something truly amazing about the Shroud of Turin. Science is revealing about this quite extraordinary artifact. But what mind-blowing detail did Dr. Campbell find that would confirm or reject the shroud's divine origin? The shroud has been proven to be much older than the experts have claimed it to be. And the good news is that you might be able to see the real shroud in all its glory in 2025. What are you waiting for? Just dive in. The mystery was found by a photograph. The Holy Shroud of Turin is primarily given to a relic now preserved at Turin, for which the claim is made that it is the actual clean linen cloth in which Joseph of Arimathea wrapped the body of Jesus Christ. This relic, though blackened by age, bears the faint but distinct impress of a human form, both back and front. If the marks we perceive were caused by human body, it is clear that the body, supine, was laid lengthwise along one half of the shroud, while the other half was doubled back over the head to cover the whole front of the body, from the face to the feet. The shroud was brought into Turin, Italy, in 1578, and has been kept in the Cathedral of St. John the Baptist in Turin since 1694. The shroud goes on exhibition only a few times a century, and when it does, millions of people slowly file past it to see the front and back images of the crucified man. The shroud is woven from linen thread made from the stems of the flax plant. In making linen thread, flax fibers are separated from the rest of the stem by allowing the stems to rot in water. The diameter of these fibers is about 15 to 20 which is about a fifth of the diameter of a human hair. A typical linen thread contains about 100 of these fibers. This shroud is one of the most sacred religious icons on earth, venerated by millions of Christians as the actual burial garment of Jesus Christ. It is also among the most fiercely debated subjects in contemporary science, an extraordinary mystery that has defied every effort at solution. But now, new evidence has emerged. Evidence that could change everything we know about this mysterious relic and the man it is said to depict. The Shroud of Turin, the centuries-old artifact, has a faint but distinct picture of a man on it.
And it's the image of a crucified man. You can see that the cloth has been damaged, it was burnt in a fire, but we'll also see the image of this man of the shroud on it. It's about 14 feet long, this artifact. I think the evidence for this being the actual burial shroud of Jesus Christ himself.
He told us to pay attention to the findings of a groundbreaking scientific study conducted in 1978. Photographer Vernon Miller's mysterious shot of the shroud showed off amazing features, including the head, eyes, nose, lips, and even traces of bloodstains. Researchers identified the stains as human blood, which aligned with torture marks and injuries resembling a crown of thorns on the body. Scientific photographer Vernon Miller spent over 100 hours guiding research on the shroud. When viewed online, the image can be magnified to reveal more details, such as examining the fabric's weave. From 1977 to 1981, a team of researchers in physics, chemistry, pathology, and engineering from various universities and U.S. government laboratories came together to study the Shroud of Turin. They concluded, "The shroud's image shows a real human being who was beaten and crucified. It is not an artistic creation. The bloodstains contain hemoglobin, and the serum contains albumin. The images remain a mystery and require further chemical research." The research project further stated, "No pigments, paint, dyes, or stains were found on the fibers of the shroud. There is clear evidence of direct contact between the fabric and the human body, which accounts for details such as scourge marks and bloodstains. However, while this contact can explain some features of the torso, it cannot account for the highly detailed facial image seen in the shroud. They also noted, scientific analysis suggests that the image may have resulted from oxidation, dehydration, and the interaction of the polysaccharide structure on the fabric. Such alterations can be replicated in a laboratory using physical and chemical processes. A similar effect on fabric can also be achieved through heat or sulfuric acid. However, no known physical or chemical method has been able to fully recreate the image, nor can any combination of physical, chemical, biological, or medical factors precisely explain how the image was formed. After nearly 50 years, since 1978 of research in science, forensics, and biblical studies, the images on the shroud continue to challenge the human intellect, demanding deeper investigation. For all of us who are waiting for something called clear evidence as a basis to believe in the sacred existence of Jesus. If someone who wants to believe in Christ learns about it, it can confirm their belief, but for the average person, evidence of God isn't the issue, it's their heart. Jesus performed miracles, and the unbelieving asked for more. He finally told them, "No more signs will be given except the sign of Jonah." Explaining just as Jonah spent 3 days inside the fish, he would die and be in the grave for 3 days. His resurrection is the greatest sign. If they refuse to believe the over 500 witnesses of Scripture, they won't believe anything God said about himself. If it's authentic, it changes nothing, and if it's not authentic, it changes nothing. And there is no way to authenticate it. We know Christ rose from the grave because it's a fact of Scripture, and true faith is a work of God. Remember that many saw the resurrected Christ at the time and didn't believe. And of course, it's never been physical scientific evidence that precipitates faith, but the risen Jesus in our own life. Carbon dating of the Shroud of Turin. It was in 1988, an international team of scientific experts performed radiocarbon dating on snippets of the Shroud of Turin. The results showed that the famous cloth did not date back to the time of Christ's crucifixion in the 1st century AD. In fact, the cloth seemed to have been manufactured sometime between 1260 and 1390 AD. The team concluded the shroud was nothing more than a medieval hoax. In the years since the stunning announcement, shroud experts and other investigators have called into question the accuracy of the dating. Some have even argued that damage to the border of the shroud in December 1532 during a fire in the chapel of the Dukes of Savoy in Chambéry, France, might in some way have changed the chemical composition of the cloth and skewed the testing results. Stephen J. Mattingly, a professor of microbiology and immunology at the University of Texas Health Sciences Center in San Antonio, also doubts the 1988 radiocarbon results, though he blames not fire, but microbes. Despite the lingering controversy, the basic science behind radiocarbon dating is disarmingly straightforward. The element carbon exists naturally on Earth in 2 stable forms, or isotopes, known as carbon-12 and carbon-13. In carbon-13, the nucleus of the atom contains 1 extra subatomic particle called a neutron. A 3rd isotope of carbon with 2 extra neutrons, known as carbon-14, is produced in the atmosphere when atoms of nitrogen are blasted by high-energy cosmic rays streaming in from space. The atom is unstable, radioactive, and eventually decays back into nitrogen-14. Because some of the radioactive atom always exists at a low level in the atmosphere and on Earth. However, it gets incorporated at a predictable rate into the cells and tissues of all living things, from bacteria to plants to people. When, for example, the organisms suck up C14, containing carbon dioxide molecules as part of their natural metabolic processes. After things die, they no longer take in C14, and so as the isotope decays back to nitrogen-14, its relative abundance steadily decreases over time. Measuring the amount of C14 in something originally derived from organic material, then a wooden artifact, say, or the fibers of a linen cloth, which are made from flax plants, tells the amount of time that has passed since the organism it came from was last alive. What that means, however, is that any contamination with an object that was more recently alive will raise the relative abundance of C14 atoms, producing an apparently younger age. In the case of the Shroud of Turin, the younger contaminants were bacteria. You might imagine that over hundreds of years or several thousand, the shroud has come in contact with many thousands of species of bacteria and fungi, and some were able to grow for short or long periods of time. Some of these organisms would be more recent and be incorporating more recent radiocarbon material. The microbes are not digesting the linen, they are eating one another, so to speak. As long as they can grow and incorporate carbon dioxide, which many microbes can do, they are actually making the shroud appear more recent as time continues. In fact, scientists have found several different species of bacteria colonizing pieces of the shroud, including some organisms that had never been seen before. They tested samples from an outside strip of the cloth removed during the 1988 dating effort. The scientific caretaker of the shroud at the time kept the strip and later provided samples to scientists. One said, "The Catholic Church did not sanction the removal and giving of the material to us and would not certify that the pieces were authentic. Nevertheless, we know that they are authentic." Intriguingly, one of the microbe species seems to be producing an unusual material that coats the linen threads with a brittle plastic-like material that made the linen difficult to cut, much like trying to cut through dry pasta. It appears that this polymer may have actually helped preserve the shroud linen through time. Similar coatings on other artifacts, the linen wrappings on mummies, for example, could also be affecting their radiocarbon ages. Some also suspect that bacteria are responsible for the shroud's ethereal image. The idea is that as the crucified man was dying, bacteria such as the common skin microbe Staphylococcus epidermi would have colonized and multiplied in his bloody wounds, creating a thin layer called a biofilm. A biofilm can soak up water like a sponge. After the man died and his body was washed, the biofilm would have absorbed water and become extremely sticky. When the burial shroud was later placed over the body, it would have adhered fast, allowing the transfer of the microbes to the fibers of the cloth. Over time, the degradation of the microbes would have produced a faint yellow imprint of the face and body that slowly darkened. They have observed the drying of bacteria on surfaces before, and noticed that they leave a straw yellow color similar to that observed with the Turin shroud. Key to the color change are unsaturated fatty acids, normally found within the membranes of all types of cells, including bacteria. The addition of oxygen atoms to the fatty acids molecules, or oxidation, changes their chemical makeup, giving rise to the yellow color. Similarly, the yellowing seen in Ring Around the Collar is due to fatty acids from the body and bacteria that have rubbed off onto the collar. Patterns of evidence. When it was evening, there came a rich man from Arimathea, named Joseph, who also was a disciple of Jesus. He went to Pilate and asked for the body of Jesus. Then Pilate ordered it to be given to him. And Joseph took the body and wrapped it in a clean linen shroud and laid it in his own new tomb, which he had cut in the rock. And he rolled a great stone to the entrance of the tomb and went away. That's how the Bible mentioned the Shroud of Turin. The matter of patterns is most relevant to a discussion of the shroud. Patterns of evidence discovered and undeniably present within the shroud weigh heavily in favor of the claim that it is Jesus' burial cloth. Researchers have discovered many individual patterns of evidence within the shroud itself, and these form a larger pattern when taken together. The Shroud of Turin is made of fine linen, woven in a 3-to-1 herringbone pattern. The direction of the twist of the strands rules out Egypt as the country of origin and affirms Palestine. The shroud's length and width are in even cubits, a unit of measurement not used in medieval Europe, where critics say the shroud was faked, but in ancient Israel. The unusual weave reflects a wealthy owner. In 2002, conservation measures were taken secretly for the shroud in Italy. With the 16th century backing cloth removed from the shroud for the first time, textile expert Mechtilde Fleury-Lemberg discovered a rare type of stitch on the backside of the shroud, which was known from only one other place, the Masada fortress in Israel, which fell to the Romans in the Jewish revolt, less than a generation from Jesus' time. The image on the shroud of a man crucified is its greatest mystery. To this day, after exhaustive scientific study and numerous attempts to duplicate the figure of the man shown on it, no one has been able to do this at the microscopic level of the linen fibers. The image is on the outermost layers of those fibers as discolorations. They are microscopic pixels. The image is not painted, despite the continued claims of people who simply repeat this explanation over and against the verdict of the experts from the Shroud of Turin research project and others before and since. The only traces of paint are from duplicates of the shroud that were pressed against the shroud to sanctify the duplicates in earlier centuries. These are tiny flakes of paint. The linen fibers themselves show no trace of brush strokes, binder, or pigment. Nothing has soaked in, nothing is present to soak in. Only in very recent times have scientists found a way to discolor linen strands as they are found in the Shroud of Turin, discolorations penetrating only to a tiny fraction of the width of a human hair. It was done with microbursts from high-energy lasers, a burst of high energy. This carries suggestions of its own about the man of the shroud because if it is Jesus, he is proclaimed to be raised from the dead. Is the shroud a snapshot of the resurrection? Anyone who has seen the actual shroud or a full-size, high-detail reproduction of it knows that the image of the crucified man is a negative rather than a positive image. How or why an alleged forger did that has no answers. But to recognize the image, one must be 6 or 8 feet back from the shroud. Any closer, and the image on the cloth is lost. This fact further argues against a forger. How could such an image be created by someone working up close? Wounds appear on the image which science has established to have been present on the cloth prior to the presence of the body image itself, and the blood has been shown to be actual human blood, type AB. Normally, blood becomes brown as it ages. The blood of the shroud is red, which seems impossible if it is 2,000 years old. This has been advanced as evidence of fakery. But blood chemists know of changes in the blood of persons under great stress or suffering, like a crucifixion victim. Bilirubin is a pigment that enters the blood with the breakdown of red cells. It causes blood to hold a red color. Did a forger use actual human blood and torture his donor so the blood would remain red for centuries, then paint the blood on the linen cloth before there was an image, all in order to fool people centuries later? Surely he took up our pain and bore our suffering, yet we considered him punished by God, stricken by him, and afflicted. But he was pierced for our transgressions, he was crushed for our iniquities. The punishment that brought us peace was on him, and by his wounds we are healed. No one knows what the truth is. When soil traces from the foot region of the shroud were analyzed for their composition with a scanning ion microprobe at Chicago's Enrico Fermi Institute, the graph of the results almost completely matched the graph read out for the aragonite soil of Jerusalem. This was literally pattern matching pattern. Pollen grains adhering to tape samples pressed against the shroud indicated that the shroud had been present in the Jerusalem area, then northern Syria, Anatolia, Constantinople, and Europe. This matched the pattern of travel hypothesized by shroud students, based on ancient references to an Edessa cloth which found its way to Constantinople, and then, as a result of the Fourth Crusade, came to France. If the shroud were just a fake, the presence of all the non-European pollens is inexplicable. An Israeli botanist, Dr. Avinoam Danin of Hebrew University, Jerusalem, asserted that he had found patterns of flowers on the cloth, flowers that bloom in Jerusalem in the spring. Professor Danin had no religious motivation to authenticate the shroud. In 4 places, an L-shaped set of burns appears on the shroud. These are damage from before the first known fire of 1532. The burns are often called poker holes. An illustrated book called the Hungarian Prey manuscript is kept in Budapest. A painting of Jesus' burial that certainly seems to portray the shroud is contained in that manuscript. Not only does the figure of Jesus match the shroud's crucified man, hair, beard, arms crossed, but the herringbone weave is shown on the cloth. And there, too, are the poker holes. The Prey manuscript is dated to 1192. This poses a great problem for those who would dismiss the shroud as a fake because of the carbon-14 dating of the shroud that happened in 1988. Many people stopped paying attention to the Shroud of Turin when they learned that the carbon-14 determined possible dates for the shroud were from 1260 to 1390. Newspaper headlines said the shroud was proved a fake, but the Hungarian Prey manuscript testifies to the shroud already in existence at least 70 years before the earliest possible carbon-14 date. The conclusion drawn by many since that time is that the shroud was repaired on its frayed edge. To restore the pattern of the cloth, colored cotton threads were invisibly woven into the cloth. Since these were younger than the rest of the shroud, they gave a reading from the Middle Ages. Now, 3 other tests for the age of ancient textiles all indicate that the Shroud of Turin is not a product of the Middle Ages, but much older. When we photographed a copy of the Shroud of Turin, the camera recognized the face and imposed a red square around it in the viewfinder. The face stands out, and not only to the camera. The man on the shroud has had the life beaten out of him, the blood drained away from him, and the breath suffocated from him. But despite all that, his face manifests a serenity. The man of the shroud seems to have been in charge, unconquered throughout the torture he endured. He looks like a person who has faithfully completed a most difficult and deadly mission. He looks like a man who knows his story isn't over. He looks like Jesus Christ. Jesus, after all, is the one whom Christians have claimed for centuries to have fit the patterns of the prophetic words of the Old Testament. After he has suffered, he will see the light of life and be satisfied. By his knowledge, my righteous servant will justify many, and he will bear their iniquities. The Shroud of Turin becomes one dot in a still larger set of dots, which form a pattern telling us the entire Bible is to be trusted, Old Testament and New Testament. Believing is not foolish, but reasonable. Believers do not sin against common sense. Multiple patterns of evidence direct us to the truth, and that's more reason to keep thinking. The Shroud of Turin seems to be the clearest evidence that Jesus Christ accepted death to redeem humanity. While we explore the origins and related aspects of this shroud, let us take a moment to reflect on the arduous journey of the one who dared to die for his people. When soil traces from the foot region of the shroud were analyzed for their composition with a scanning ion microprobe at Chicago's Enrico Fermi Institute, the graph of the results almost completely matched the graph read out for the aragonite soil of Jerusalem. This was literally pattern matching pattern. Pollen grains adhering to tape samples pressed against the shroud indicated that the shroud had been present in the Jerusalem area, then northern Syria, Anatolia, Constantinople, and Europe. This matched the pattern of travel hypothesized by shroud students, based on ancient references to an Edessa cloth which found its way to Constantinople, and then, as a result of the Fourth Crusade, came to France. If the shroud were just a fake, the presence of all the non-European pollens is inexplicable. An Israeli botanist, Dr. Avinoam Danin of Hebrew University, Jerusalem, asserted that he had found patterns of flowers on the cloth, flowers that bloom in Jerusalem in the spring. Professor Danen had no religious motivation to authenticate the shroud. The greatest message of the Shroud of Turin. The Holy Shroud of Turin is primarily given to a relic now preserved at Turin, for which the claim is made that it is the actual clean linen cloth in which Joseph of Arimathea wrapped the body of Jesus Christ. This relic, though blackened by age, bears the faint but distinct impress of a human form, both back and front. If the marks we perceive were caused by human body, it is clear that the body, supine, was laid lengthwise along one half of the shroud, while the other half was doubled back over the head to cover the whole front of the body, from the face to the feet. The shroud was brought into Turin, Italy, in 1578, and has been kept in the Cathedral of St. John the Baptist in Turin since 1694. The shroud goes on exhibition only a few times a century, and when it does, millions of people slowly file past it to see the front and back images of the crucified man. The shroud is woven from linen thread made from the stems of the flax plant. In making linen thread, flax fibers are separated from the rest of the stem by allowing the stems to rot in water. The diameter of these fibers is about 15 to 20 which is about a fifth of the diameter of a human hair. A typical linen thread contains about 100 of these fibers. Luke and the other three Gospels include this account of Jesus' burial after his crucifixion. On the morning of Jesus' resurrection, Luke records that Peter saw the strips of linen by themselves, whereas the Gospel of John states that Peter saw the strips of linen lying there, as well as the cloth that had been wrapped around Jesus' head. The cloth was still lying in its place, separate from the linen. This separate cloth has generated passionate interest today because many people think it might be the Shroud of Turin, believed to be Jesus' burial cloth. If true, the shroud would provide compelling evidence for the truth of Christianity. But is it really Jesus' burial cloth? What we know and what we don't know. The answer to that question relies on historical, scientific, and biblical data, as well as input from many other disciplines. Often, the actual data and the popular conception don't line up well and make it difficult to understand the complex issues surrounding the shroud. It seems indisputable that the shroud came from someone who was crucified. Further, the image and stains on the shroud validate the Bible's description of crucifixion. As physical evidence of that restoration, the shroud presents a mirror of the gospel, which is sacrificial love beyond all fathoming. Everything depends on it and is downstream from it. Everything else is scaffolded on this revelation. Jesus told us, "Take up your cross each day and follow me," meaning that his cross and passion are inextricably woven into the life of his followers. The Paschal mystery, Jesus' passion, death, and resurrection, is the source and summit of Christian life. If you look at the Gospels themselves, they are passion narratives with long introductions. Pope Benedict XVI stated, "Don't be afraid of the cross. It's the source of every blessing." The wounded Christ, clearly depicted on the shroud, invites the faithful to claim his wounds, as well as their own, as a conduit of grace. They are precisely where his grace flows into us. Jesus, upon his death on the cross, descended into the world, filling it with light and hope. When light shines in darkness, the darkness is dispelled. So it is when Christ freely lays down his life and takes it back up. He's showing himself as being utterly of a higher order, Dr. Dalton pointed out. In truth, God has already definitively won the battle. The only question is, are we remaining in Christ? Christ, the head, is already seated in glory. If we're members of his body, if we remain with him, we are co-heirs. Regarding Jesus' death and resurrection, we have the documents. We have Matthew, Mark, Luke, John, and others. And we have monuments, namely, archaeological objects such as the Shroud of Turin and the Sudarium of Oviedo, the latter being the cloth that covered Jesus' face while he was taken down from the cross. These objects are consistent with scriptural accounts of Jesus' passion and death. Not only are they compatible with the biblical narrative, but they're mutually illuminating. The artifact on one hand and the narrative on the other hand, both shedding light on each other. Every attempt to reproduce the shroud by any naturalistic means has failed. People can't do it in a lab, especially not at the micro level. Every detail, from the shape of the body and the ratios of one limb to the other, to the blood flows, to the folding of the thumbs from damage to the nerves in the hands, is captured with medical precision. In-depth studies of the shroud in the 1970s ruled out the presence of varnish, pigments, brush strokes, directionality, or any trace whatsoever of human artwork. Nor was the image produced by heat or by any type of photography, which wasn't invented until the 19th century. There are multiple hypotheses for how the shroud came into being, but none can be scientifically proven. That's where Christians need to step up and say, what if it was not created by naturalistic means? What if it's the natural result of a supernatural occurrence? The message of the Shroud of Turin is the same as that of the gospel narratives of Jesus' life, death, and resurrection. God's unfathomable love. Jesus shows divine love in ways that we simply cannot doubt. It is in deed and in truth that He loves us. And when you look at the cross, when you're looking at His image in the shroud, you're seeing Him say, I love you. You must know this. Every detail in the biblical narratives of the Passion reveals some aspect of that love. It would be too easy to glance over the details of the Passion, but the shroud forces you to pause on it. The cross was the means by which Jesus, who had emptied Himself of glory in becoming human, returned to His glorified state at the right hand of the Father. In order to follow Christ, people must take up their own crosses in the form of the trials they face each day. Jesus tells us, I am the way, the truth, and the life. So, can we expect any other pathway than the one He showed us? Learning about and venerating the shroud inevitably leads to a deeper understanding of the mission Jesus came to fulfill. Beholding and contemplating the image of Christ causes transformation to come within us. In that way, the shroud is just the doorbell. It says, come in. The shroud offers an astounding opportunity and a credible means of sharing the gospel with people who do not yet believe. Our faith is not about fairy tales or fables, but an event in history that actually took place. We celebrate the incarnation, that the Word became flesh and made His dwelling among us. From that place, He's reborn into glory. That's a picture of what we all must also do. We die with Him in order to rise with Him. Because of its holy meaning, you may wonder how to visit the Turin Shroud. If you're traveling to Turin or the surrounding areas, you must visit the Turin Cathedral, where the Holy Shroud is kept. But bear in mind, the original cloth is not on public display. The shroud is in such a fragile state that it isn't put on display for the general public. It is guarded by bulletproof glass and security cameras. You can visit the chapel where it's safely kept, and you will see a replica of the shroud. The good news is that you might be able to see the real shroud in all its glory if you travel to Turin in 2025. The Pope announced that the Shroud of Turin might be displayed to the public in 2025, coinciding with the Jubilee year. Specific dates are not confirmed yet, but the Vatican will announce them soon. Hopefully. The rare display of the Turin Shroud already happened in 2000, 2010, and 2015. If it happens in 2025, or maybe 2026, it will be a big event for the Christian community and Turin. So if you plan to visit the city, you better plan it as soon as the Vatican announces the dates. If you can't make it to the 2025 Holy Shroud public display, and if only admiring the Shroud Chapel is not enough for you, there is a place where you can get more info and be a bit closer to it. The Most Holy Shroud Museum, in Italian, Il Museo della Sindone, is where you need to go. At the museum, you can learn details about the shroud's fascinating history and its many mysteries, replicas, and incredible displays of the artifact.